The late afternoon sun bled gold across the cracked concrete paths of Lincoln Green Park, casting long shadows beneath the ancient oaks. On a weathered bench near the edge of the playground, James Carter sat alone, his body hunched but resolute. At 72, his face bore the lines of too many battles both abroad and at home. His jacket, an old bomber lined with fading patches of his unit, whispered stories no one else seemed willing to hear. Around him, the park buzzed with the laughter of children and the rustle of summer leaves, but no one noticed the old man with the tired eyes. To them, he was a fixture, a relic. Yet inside, James carried a memory. The jungle, the gunfire, the brotherhood that once defined his every breath. Now, all he wanted was a moment of peace under the same sun that had once shone on him in foreign lands. But in this country, peace was a currency he'd never been allowed to fully own. If you think you've heard this story before, think again. Stay with us to the end, because what happens next will change everything you thought you knew about loyalty, justice. And while you're here, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. Let's show the world that every voice and every story deserves to be heard. James Carter shifted slightly on the bench, feeling the familiar ache in his knees, a quiet reminder of decades spent in service and the toll it had exacted. He adjusted the brim of his cap, letting the warm sun filter through the branches overhead. The laughter of children drifted in and out like a song from another life, but he stayed focused on his breath, his memories. Then he felt it, a change in the air, a tension that hummed like a wire pulled too tight. Across the park's worn paths, 3 uniformed officers emerged, their steps slow but deliberate. They moved in a tight formation, like men who had already decided what they would find. Their radios crackled with distant voices, but none of them spoke. The one in front, Officer David Whitaker, wore the tired eyes of a man who'd learned to hide behind procedures. His jaw was set, his expression unreadable. Beside him, Officer Mark Vaughn radiated a different energy impatience, a swagger that reeked of authority unchecked. His hand hovered too close to his hip, like a man who wanted to be feared rather than respected. A half smirk played at the edge of his mouth, the kind of smile that made James' stomach knot. Trailing behind them was Officer Henry Foster, his grip tight on the leash of a large German shepherd named Ranger. The dog walked with disciplined precision, head high, ears alert. Its coat gleamed in the sunlight, a testament to its training. But there was something in its eyes, something James recognized from a lifetime ago. The trio stopped a few feet from James, their shadows merging with his. Whitaker spoke first, his voice even but cold. "Afternoon, sir. We've had some reports of a man loitering on this bench. You've been here a while?" James met his gaze, steady but calm. "Just catching the sun. I come here most days. Helps me breathe." Vaughn snorted, his eyes sharp. "You got ID on you?" His tone wasn't a question, it was an accusation. James reached slowly into his jacket pocket, every movement deliberate. He'd learned the hard way how sudden gestures could be misunderstood. He pulled out his battered leather wallet and flipped it open to reveal a laminated Cardis veteran's ID, worn at the edges from years of handling. Whitaker leaned in, eyes scanning the card. For a moment, something flickered in his gazed out, maybe even respect, but it vanished as quickly as it came. Vaughn, on the other hand, barely glanced at it before scoffing. "Could be fake," he muttered, his voice dripping with contempt. James exhaled, the weight of 1,000 similar moments pressing down on his chest. "I fought for this country," he said softly, almost to himself. "Bled for men who didn't look twice at me when I came home. I buried brothers who never got to come back." Ranger shifted, the leash taut in Foster's grip. The dog let out a low, uncertain whine, as if caught between commands and instinct. A few feet away, a woman clutched her child tighter as she passed, eyes flicking from the officers to James and back again. A man with a phone hesitated, then raised it low to his chest, recording. James felt it, all the eyes, the judgment, the unspoken verdict. He sat straighter, not because he wasn't afraid, but because he'd learned long ago that fear only gave them power. "I'm just trying to breathe," he said, his voice steady. But in this country, he knew, even that could be a crime. James Carter felt the weight of their gazes press down like lead. Officer Vaughan's stare was unrelenting, his jaw tight, eyes cold. A bead of sweat formed on his temple and slid down his cheek, though the sun had already begun its descent. Vaughan shifted his stance, an unconscious tick of someone ready to escalate. "Look," James began, his voice a careful balance between calm and the instinct to defend himself. "I'm just sitting here. This is where I come every day. It's not a crime to exist." Vaughan's lips twisted into a sneer. "You people always think you're above the rules," he spat. The venom in his tone made James's stomach clench. "Maybe you got that fancy ID, but I've seen plenty of fakes. How do I know you didn't pick that up at a pawn shop?" Whitaker shifted uneasily beside him. His eyes darted between James and the gathering crowd, families, teenagers, a woman pushing a stroller. Some faces carried curiosity, others a creeping unease. Phones were out now, recording. James kept his hands visible, palms resting on his knees. "I don't want trouble," he said. "I just want to be left in peace." "That's the thing," Vaughan snapped, his voice louder now. "People say they don't want trouble, but they bring it on themselves." He turned to Officer Foster, who still held Ranger's leash. "Let the dog check him." Foster hesitated. "Sir, he's not resisting." "Maybe." "That's an order," Vaughan barked, his voice slicing through the air like a blade. "Deploy the 9. We need to be sure." The park seemed to hold its breath. The cicadas in the trees fell silent. Even the children's laughter died out as the reality of the moment sank in. James' chest tightened. The leash strained in Foster's white-knuckled grip. Ranger's ears pricked, his body tensing as training took over. James closed his eyes for a beat. In that darkness, memories flooded back. The hot jungle air, the sounds of gunfire and men screaming, the smell of sweat and fear and gunpowder. He remembered the German shepherds they'd worked with, the same breed, the same instincts. He trusted them with his life, and they'd trusted him with theirs. His heart pounded. The hush around him was heavy, like the air before a storm. When he opened his eyes, Ranger was already pulling forward, muscles taut, teeth bared in a snarl. The dog's handler, Foster, looked like a man on the edge of a cliff, one push away from losing control. "Officer, please," James said, his voice steady but urgent. "I've done nothing wrong. I'm not resisting." "Then you've got nothing to fear," Vaughan cut him off, his words like ice. "Ranger, go!" The leash slipped from Foster's hand, and time fractured. Ranger lunged, a blur of tan and black fur, eyes locked on James with lethal focus. Gasps tore through the crowd. A mother shrieked, clutching her child to her chest. A teenage boy fumbled his phone, the screen catching the sun as it tumbled to the ground. James didn't move. His training, the same training that had carried him through years of war, told him to stay still. Any sudden movement could be seen as aggression. Any sign of panic could seal his fate. His eyes locked on the dog, and for a heartbeat that seemed to stretch into eternity, everything else vanished. In that breathless space between predator and prey, James saw more than a dog. He saw a brother in arms, a soldier who had once stood beside him in a different kind of battle. He saw the same loyalty, the same pain, the same unspoken promise that no one would be left behind. Ranger's teeth were inches away, his breath hot against James's skin. The world narrowed to a single point, the moment of impact. James's lips parted. He whispered, voice hoarse but certain, "It's me." Something shifted in Ranger's eyes, something ancient, something beyond training or instinct. The snarl faltered. His ears twitched. The growl in his throat died in a choked whimper. The dog froze, paws planted in the grass, head tilting as if searching for something he'd forgotten. The park erupted in stunned silence. James's breath trembled. And in that impossibly long second before the world caught up with itself, it was no longer just a man facing a dog, it was a veteran facing a memory, a bond forged in another lifetime. And somewhere in that memory, the war dog recognized its handler. Ranger stood frozen, inches from James Carter's knees, his body quivering like a taut wire. The trained snarl that moments earlier had promised violence now dissolved into a low, uncertain whine. His head tilted, ears twitching, nose working furiously as if trying to piece together the memory hidden beneath the sweat, the years, and the scent of a man the system had already condemned. James stared back, his breath ragged, but his gaze unwavering. He'd seen that look before, in the jungles where men fought and bled for one another without asking what color their skin was. Ranger's eyes brown, rimmed with worry, weren't the eyes of a killer. They were the eyes of a soldier who'd been ordered to do something that didn't feel right. "Ranger," James whispered, his voice breaking on the name. The word felt like a prayer, a lifeline thrown across the decades. "It's me. You remember, don't you?" A hush spread through the crowd, like a slow ripple on a still lake. The mother who had screamed moments earlier now clutched her child to her chest, her own fear mixing with awe. A man's phone trembled in his hands, the camera capturing every second, every tear on James' weathered face. Ranger whined again, lower this time, and his body slackened. He stepped forward not with the aggression of a trained attack dog, but with the tentative steps of an old friend rediscovering a lost companion. His tail, once a rod of tension, drooped, then wagged slowly, like a hesitant drumbeat of hope. James reached out a trembling hand, palm up, open. "It's okay, boy," he murmured. "I'm right here." Ranger inched closer, sniffed the calloused fingers that had once fed him scraps beneath a canopy of jungle leaves. And then, without a single command from Foster, he pressed his snout into James's chest and let out a sigh that sounded almost like relief. The crowd gasped, a collective exhale that broke the spell of fear. A woman sobbed openly, tears streaking her cheeks. Foster staggered forward, confusion etched on his face. "Ranger," he called out, his voice small against the weight of the moment. "Heal! Ranger, heal!" But Ranger ignored him. He leaned harder into James, eyes half closed, tail now thumping steadily on the grass. It was as if the dog had chosen, with the simple certainty that only animals seem to possess, where his loyalty belonged. James closed his eyes, his free hand cradling Ranger's massive head. "You remember?" he whispered, tears now streaming freely. "All those nights on the line, when it was just you and me in the dark. You never let me down, boy. Not then, not now." Vaughn's face turned the color of ash, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. This doesn't make sense," he sputtered. "Dogs don't just do that unless they've been trained to." His voice cracked with desperation. The accusation hung in the air, a dying spark in a forest of disbelief. Officer Whitaker, who had stood silent for so long, finally spoke. His voice was hoarse, the weight of the moment pressing every syllable. Maybe the dog remembers something we forgot," he said, his gaze lowered in shame. "Maybe he sees the man we refuse to see." The words hit harder than any bullet James had ever faced. He opened his eyes, meeting Whitaker's. "That's the thing," James said, voice trembling but strong. "He remembers the man. You only saw the threat." The crowd around them shifted. Some wept quietly. Others clapped their hands over their mouths in shock. A teenage boy dropped his skateboard, the wheels spinning in the silence. And then, like a storm cloud splitting the voice of Nathaniel Cross, deep and fierce, cut through the air. "That man saved my life in Da Nang." Nathaniel's voice roared across the park, his broad shoulders trembling with emotion. "You think you can sick a dog on a hero because of the color of his skin? You think the rest of us are going to stand by and watch?" He moved forward, his combat boots pounding the grass, medals from another war clinking softly on his chest. "You unleashed that dog, hoping it would tear down the man you couldn't. But look at him now." Nathaniel's finger pointed like a bayonet, unwavering. The cameras zoomed in, every phone capturing the moment, the raw truth of a black veteran holding a dog that refused to kill him. Ranger's tail wagged, a silent metronome of loyalty, and the park erupted not with violence, but with the unspoken reckoning that had waited too long. James cradled Ranger's head, his eyes shining with tears, and the quiet, unshakable dignity of a man who had carried his burdens alone for too many years. He looked at the officers Whitaker, Foster, even Vaughan, and saw not just their uniforms but the weight of the system that had built them. "You see a black man," James said, voice like steel wrapped in sorrow. "He sees his brother." And in that moment, the dog, the man, and the crowd became a testament that no training, no command, no hate could ever fully erase the bonds of memory and humanity. The air in the park felt different now, charged, heavy with a truth that couldn't be pushed back into the shadows. Ranger sat at James Carter's side, tail still wagging, head pressed into the veteran's chest as if he'd found his way home after being lost in the fog of orders and training. The crowd encircled them in a trembling hush, every phone camera raised, every eye fixed on the unfolding reckoning. Nathaniel Cross stood firm, his chest heaving with unspent rage and pride. His voice, hoarse but unwavering, cut through the charged silence like a clarion call. "I was there," he began, his gaze locked on Officer Vaughan. "Da Nang, 1971. I took a bullet in my leg. Couldn't move. Everyone else thought I was done for, but he..." Nathaniel pointed a trembling finger at James. "He carried me 3 kilometers through mud and mortar fire, with 2 bullets in his own back and a broken rib. I owe him my life." A murmur rippled through the crowd, raw disbelief giving way to a swelling sense of injustice. Vaughan's face turned crimson, his eyes darting between James and the dog that refused his command. He opened his mouth, but no words came. The smirk, the swagger gone. In its place, a flicker of fear, a man unmasked. Officer Whitaker shifted his weight, shame etched into the lines around his eyes. His voice was low, shaky. I didn't know." The confession hung there, fragile and trembling. "You didn't care to know," Nathaniel snapped, his anger now a righteous flame. "You didn't see a man sitting on a bench. You saw a threat that needed to be controlled. That's not policing, that's profiling." Ranger let out a low whine, as if he too understood the weight of the accusation. Foster crouched down beside him, his hand hovering near the dog's neck. "I don't understand," he whispered, his voice almost a plea. "He's never disobeyed before. Not once. He's trained to respond to threats." James met Foster's eyes, the lines on his face carved deeper by the years. "Maybe that's the problem," he said softly. "You trained him to see threats, but he remembers the man who taught him to see brothers." He turned his gaze to the crowd, eyes glistening. "That's what you forgot to teach yourselves." A woman in the crowd sobbed, clutching her child. A teenage boy with a skateboard shook his head, tears welling. "This is messed up," he muttered. Another woman, older, her hair streaked with grey, wiped her eyes and whispered, "God help us." Vaughan's voice finally cracked the air, brittle and desperate. "We were following protocol," he insisted, but it sounded like a confession rather than a defense. "We had reports of a suspicious person." "Suspicious?" Nathaniel's voice thundered. "A 72-year-old black man sitting on a park bench is suspicious to you? That's the truth you need to face." He stepped closer to Vaughan, his eyes blazing. "You unleashed a dog on a hero. You tried to sick an animal on the man who saved more lives than you'll ever know. And now you're going to stand here and pretend you were just doing your job." The question echoed through the park, hanging heavy as the setting sun. Whitaker's face sagged, lines of regret etching deeper with every second. "I failed you," he whispered to James. "I failed everyone watching this. I thought following orders was enough, but I see now it's not." His voice cracked, a tremor that betrayed the collapse of his certainty. James stood slowly, his hand still resting on Ranger's head. The dog stayed at his side, a silent testament to loyalty and memory. "You all think it's about one bad apple," James said, his voice firm but filled with sorrow. "It's not. It's about a system that trains you to see me as a problem instead of a person. A system that makes you think a dog should decide whether I deserve to breathe free air." He scanned the crowd, his eyes connecting with each face. But today, this dog remembered. He remembered the man, not the threat. Maybe that's what makes him better than some of you." A hush fell, thick as dusk, heavy with the knowledge that something had broken, something that couldn't be mended with apologies or excuses. The crowd shifted, the weight of a nation's unspoken guilt pressing into every chest. Nathaniel laid a hand on James' shoulder. "We're with you, brother," he said, his voice steady as stone. "This ends here." James closed his eyes, the memory of wars fought and brothers lost pressing against his heart. When he opened them, the world had changed. He could feel it in the air, in the eyes staring back at him not just with pity or guilt, but with a newfound understanding that maybe, just maybe, the fight he'd been carrying alone for so long had finally become theirs too. The hush that had descended on Lincoln Green Park held steady, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. James Carter stood at the center, his hand resting gently on Ranger's head. The dog stayed close, tail brushing the grass in a quiet rhythm of loyalty. Around them, the faces of strangers' mothers, teenagers, elders watched not with suspicion but with a raw, unfiltered ache of realization. Nathaniel Cross stepped forward, his boots crunching on the gravel. "We can't let this end with a headline," he said, his voice rough but unbreakable. "We can't let this man go home and sit alone on a bench tomorrow like nothing ever happened. This is our line in the sand." James met his eyes. "I'm not looking for revenge," he said, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "I've seen enough of that for one lifetime. What I want is change, real change, so no one else has to live their days waiting to be judged for the color of their skin." Officer Whitaker stepped forward, his badge suddenly looking like a weight around his neck. "Mr. Carter," he began, voice trembling, "I don't expect forgiveness, but I need you to know this will not be swept under the rug. I will testify to what happened here. I'll make sure my department sees this for what it is." James studied him for a long moment, his eyes tired but not unkind. "It starts with you," he said quietly. "But it doesn't end there." Foster, still kneeling beside Ranger, looked up, his own eyes red. "He's not just a dog," he said softly, voice cracking. "He's a partner, and he made the right call today. I should have listened to him, to my gut, instead of just following orders." He paused, pressing a shaking hand to his chest. "I won't forget this." A teenage girl with a phone stepped forward, tears streaming down her cheeks. "What can we do?" she asked, her voice small but determined. "How do we make this right?" James straightened, his shoulders squaring like a soldier stepping into the light. "You hold them accountable," he said, his words slow, deliberate. "You make sure this doesn't become just another viral video that fades in a week. You demand policy changes. You demand training that teaches officers to see the human before the threat. You stand up not just when it's easy, but when it's hard." The girl nodded fiercely, determination shining through her tears. Around them, the crowd found its voice a murmur that grew into a promise. Never again. Parents comforted their children, teenagers exchanged glances that spoke of a new kind of awareness. The camera phones didn't lower this time. They stayed up, capturing every second, every vow. James looked around at the sea of faces, each one now a witness, each one now a potential ally. "This isn't just my fight," he said. "It's all of ours. Because if a man like me can't sit on a bench without being seen as a threat, then none of us are really free." Nathaniel placed a steady hand on his shoulder. "We hear you, brother," he said, his voice deep and resolute. "And we're with you, all the way." A breeze lifted through the park, carrying with it a sense of renewal, a promise that this moment would not fade quietly. James felt the weight of it, but for the first time in a long time, he didn't carry it alone. Days later, the story of James Carter and Ranger had spread far beyond the cracked concrete of Lincoln Green Park. The footage, raw, unfiltered, unforgettable, had ignited a firestorm. News channels replayed the moment Ranger pressed his head into James's chest, the disbelief on the officers' faces, and the quiet dignity of a man who had carried his burdens too long. At City Hall, the mayor stood at a podium, her voice trembling with urgency. "What happened in that park was not just a confrontation, it was a revelation," she declared, her eyes scanning the sea of reporters and community leaders. It exposed a wound we've ignored for too long. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. This city owes James Carter an apology and a promise that his story will not be forgotten. Legislation moved swiftly through the council chambers proposals for body cameras that couldn't be turned off, mandatory anti-bias training, and a civilian oversight board with teeth. It wasn't everything, but it was more than had ever been done before. In the park itself, a small group gathered each evening, sitting on the same bench where James had once waited in quiet agony. Parents brought their children to lay flowers, small notes, even stuffed animals for Ranger. The bench had become more than wood and metal. It was now a place of remembrance and reflection. One evening, a group of high school students arrived with sketchbooks and pencils. They drew Ranger's face, his steady eyes, and the way he'd leaned into James with unwavering loyalty. Their art captured not just a dog, but the bond between memory and humanity. James, too, felt the change. He no longer sat on that bench alone. Strangers stopped to shake his hand, to ask about his service, to apologize on behalf of a city that had failed him too many times. Each time, he'd nod, his voice steady but weary. "Thank you," he'd say. "But remember, it's not just about me. It's about everyone who's ever been treated like a threat when all they wanted was to be seen." Ranger became a symbol in his own right, Hero's dog who'd chosen loyalty over orders. Foster, the officer who had once held the leash, now stood beside James at community meetings, his uniform a reminder that change sometimes starts from within. He spoke honestly about what he'd learned, his voice raw with humility. "I trusted the training more than my gut," he'd confess. "But that day, Ranger taught me to see the man before the threat. And I won't forget that lesson." Everywhere, people talked about it. In barbershops, at dinner tables, on street corners. "Did you see that video?" they'd ask. "Did you see how the dog refused to hurt him?" And in that question lay a deeper one. What does it say about us when a dog shows more humanity than the people who hold the leash? For the first time in years, James felt like maybe, just maybe, the burden he'd carried alone was being shared. That somewhere in the crowd, in the city, in the nation, people were beginning to see him not as a shadow on a bench, but as a man who had survived more than any of them would ever know, and who, even now, refused to be silent. As the sun dipped low behind the oaks of Lincoln Green Park, James Carter sat once more on the old bench. Ranger lay at his feet, head resting on his paws, eyes half closed but ears still alert. Around them, the park hummed with new energy, a place no longer defined by fear, but by the memory of what had happened and the promise of what could be. Teenagers paused their skateboards and nodded at James with respect. Parents walked by with children who pointed and whispered, "That's the man the dog remembered." Flowers rested at the base of the bench, notes of thanks, small drawings of Ranger, and letters promising to stand against injustice. James took it all in, his heart full. He knew change wouldn't come overnight. He knew there would be setbacks, that prejudice could hide in shadows. But he also knew that what had started here, a single moment when a dog chose loyalty over hatred, had sparked something bigger than himself. He looked at Ranger, the loyal friend who'd refused to see him as a threat, and then at the horizon beyond the trees. "We did good, boy," he murmured. "We showed them what it means to remember." Ranger's tail thumped the grass, a steady beat of hope. James closed his eyes, a tired but peaceful smile on his lips. For the first time in a long time, he felt truly seen, and he knew that the world, finally, had started to see itself, too.